It's Tuesday the 26th of, not May, March, which means this was scheduled to be the last Tisky before Brexit. It's not. And indeed, a Brexit resolution seems more distant than ever, though the end of May's premiership seems somewhat more in sight. Rumours abounded this morning she would announce a date for her departure at the 1922 group of Tory MPs tomorrow. May's promise to stand down is, of course, a last-gasp attempt to win Tory backbenchers to vote for her deal. We might see a meaningful vote free later in the week. Before that, tomorrow, we will have a series of indicative votes where MPs will indicate, I suppose, what option they might back. We're supposed to find out tomorrow if there's a majority in the Commons for anything. We'll discuss today whether that will happen. If you're confused, don't worry. To make sense of the chaos, I'm joined by Tom Kibasi, Director of the IPPR. Thank you for coming in.
Michael. Thanks for having me.
And Novara Media's very own Dalia. Gebrial.
Good evening, Michael.
I wanted to get Tom in especially today to talk about the Labour's sort of soft Brexit proposal. So everyone who's watching this show will have been used to seeing many a mainstream journalist feign ignorance about Labour's policy, even though it's been fairly clear for over a year now. So we can get into the nitty-gritty of what a Labour soft Brexit would look like later in the show. First of all, I want to get up to speed on what the hell is going on in British politics. So these indicative votes tomorrow, Dalia, that was a big defeat for the government yesterday. What did it mean? What was the significance of that?
So it means basically what you outlined earlier, which is that we're going to find out if there is a parliamentary majority for any kind of outcome that's on the table right now. So, I mean, I think it is significant because so far we've just been like flogging the dead horse that is Theresa May's deal, and it's been essentially getting us nowhere. And now we're going to have a chance to kind of see if there is a majority for anything. We had a discussion like previously off air beforehand where we thought that there probably wouldn't be a majority for anything specifically. So at the moment, MPs are submitting sort of proposals for what they think should be on the ballot paper. So far, the predictions of what that could be would be like a no deal, a sort of Canada-style free trade agreement, May's deal, which obviously won't get a majority, May's deal plus a customs union with the EU, the Labour Party's plan, a kind of common market, also known as the Norway Plus deal, and a second Brexit referendum or revoking Article 50. So that's quite a big sort of spectrum between like the hardest possible Brexit and sort of essentially remaining in the EU, doing a Brexit in name only, or even revoking Brexit altogether. So I do hope that this will actually mean like a move out of this stasis that we've been in for so long. But as you mentioned, it's only indicative. So ultimately, it could happen tomorrow and have absolutely no impact on Theresa May's negotiating strategies, which have been so successful so far.
Tom, is there any chance in your mind that tomorrow can break the deadlock that Brexit has put on British politics?
I think it's possible that they make some progress in identifying what has a majority. And of course, for Theresa May, it may be that the indicative votes is a helpful stepping stone. If she can demonstrate that no option has a majority, then she can say plausibly to her backbenchers, well, the only Brexit on offer is her deal. So it may actually end up being helpful to her. And she can also, if it ends up that the option that gets closest to a majority is a softer Brexit, she'll hold that over the ERG and say, look, it's either my deal or something softer.
So there seems to be sort of a new consensus that there is nothing that will pass on these indicative votes, at least tomorrow. That seems to me like a bit of a change of tune, because I've been hearing for months that there is a majority in the Commons for one thing, which is a soft Brexit. And has that gone out the window? Why do you think that we won't expect to see a majority tomorrow for May's deal plus the customs union and alignment with the single market, for example?
Well, look, a lot of people think there is a Commons majority for a softer Brexit, and it may well be that tomorrow that's what gets flushed out. I'm a little less convinced, but it really depends on how MPs choose to play it, what their tactics are. If they are really trying to find a solution and a way through all this, then they will support any option that they can plausibly live with, and they'll set the bar at what can they live with. The question is, if they are trying to achieve their preferred outcome, then they will lock in simply behind that and not support anything else. Now, a big question for me is what the SNP do. I don't think anyone's been paying any attention to the SNP at all in all of this, but they have 35 votes. Last night in the House of Commons, in the vote on the Letwin amendment about whether there would be these indicative votes, 30 Tories rebelled. So you've got to assume that probably the maximum number of Tories who would support a softer Brexit has got to be 30, and some of those are Brexiteers, by the way. So, that's an optimistic view, is that 30 Tories would support a softer Brexit. If the SNP stick by the line that they've been saying of late, which is that they are now in favour of a revocation or of a second referendum in order to stay in the EU, I don't see how a customs union or a single market deal is going to get to a majority. But it depends, right? If the SNP decide that they're going to vote for a customs union, single market, and a second referendum because they say, well, they want a softer Brexit if there's going to be Brexit, that will produce a different result. So I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty, but I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, this idea that there's clearly a Commons majority for a softer Brexit, I think is going to be tested tomorrow.
And what do you think Labour will vote for? I mean, so we've found out today that what MPs will be presented with is a list of all the different options, and they can tick as many as they find acceptable. So ideally, I suppose this system is designed so that they can each potentially tick the 4 they find acceptable, and then we see that there's a few available options that could pass the Commons, and we already know that May's deal isn't one of them. We can already kind of guess that second referendum isn't one of them, but there might be a few in the middle that could get passed. What do you think the Labour front bench are going to be ticking? Are they just going to be ticking their Labour deal, or do you think they'll be ticking also a customs union or a people's vote or whatever?
So I don't yet know whether it's been decided whether they'll be whipping tomorrow or not, whether it'll be a free vote for MPs. I suspect if they whip, they'll say that Labour MPs are expected to vote for Labour's plan. They may say, given this process is indicative, you have to vote for Labour's plan, but feel free to vote for anything else that you want to, which would be quite, I would have thought, a relatively sensible move. I suspect that you'll see the Labour leadership will feel compelled to vote for a public vote as one of the options because of the party conference commitments, but I think it's very unclear what the rest of the Labour backbench will do. It depends on how locked into a position they are. The logical thing to do, if you are clear about the outcome that you want, is to only vote for the outcome that you want.
Because you don't want any other outcome to win. You don't want your second best to win. You'd prefer none of them get through these indicative votes if it's not your one that does.
If you're committed to a particular outcome. And I suspect that what we'll see is that there are some MPs who are very committed to particular outcomes and some MPs who live with an awful lot of different things.
Okay, these indicative votes will all be somewhat academic if May manages to get her deal passed on the third attempt. Meaningful vote free, MV free, as it's been called in typically blunt fashion. May's campaign to get this to happen involved last week speech to the whole country blaming everything on MPs. It turned out this wasn't actually a particularly good policy, given that it was those MPs she needs to win over to vote for her deal. So with her tail in between her legs in Brussels the following day, she got quite close to apologising, and on the weekend returned to probably her favoured strategy of schmoozing the far right of her own party.
I'm not sure she got close to apologising.
Well, she said that everyone's going through a difficult time and everyone's really trying their best.
Yeah, so, but it wasn't even a non-apology apology. It was like not even close.
Yeah, okay.
It was like, it wasn't like openly hostile and aggressive.
Well, I mean, the point was, even the sort of displaying a little bit of regret makes sense if your speech was sort of off the cuff and you said it in the heat of the moment. But she obviously wrote it in the morning, announced to the media that she was going to do a speech at 6:30, and then the next day was like, oh, it was the heat of the moment, maybe, oh, we're all having a difficult time. And it was like the whole thing of going to the country to make out that the MPs were the enemies of the people and going to block Brexit.
It was a strategy, yeah.
It was a strategy that was very much foreplanned. Anyway, that strategy seems to be over. She's gone back to schmoozing the far right. On the weekend, they went to Chequers, which is the Prime Minister's country retreat. We can get the list of invitees to this meeting up, I think. So the cast list is Jacob Rees-Mogg, Steve Baker, Dominic Raab, Damian Green, David Davis, Ian Duncan-Smith, the PM herself, the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, Brandon Lewis, Steve Barclay, Alistair Burt, Michael Gove, and David Liddington.
So beyond the Prime Minister's committed some really serious sins in a past life.
Yeah, well, I mean,
that is
beyond noting
her dinner party guest list.
Well, I mean, she's got particular taste as well. She seems to like older white men because all 13 of them fit into that demographic.
Well, they love Brexit, right?
That's what she wishes she could do.
The list also made me wonder because you imagine, they're in private, they've gone away to get away from the city, and you imagine some quid pro quos going on here. She's trying to get these guys to vote for her deal. They're going to be asking for things. I'm wondering what it's going to be. Is it Jacob Rees-Mogg? Is it going to be a stall at the next Tory party conference for Traditional Britain, the far-right group he likes to hang around with? Damien Green, I was wondering if it would just be a delay to the porn ban. Potential. But any concerns about what would go on in Chequers were not allayed by the nickname this group of 13 old white men gave themselves, which was, yes, Grand Wizards, just like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. This was a story broken by Laura Koinsberg without realising the connotations of Grand Wizards.
She then later tried to sort of cover them, which I don't understand why she would feel the need to do that as a journalist, but tried to cover them by being oh, it was an in joke. It's not doesn't have any of those connotations, as if Grand Wizard is a common phrase. It's it's only ever been used once in by one specific group, and I think that this goes to show actually how I don't the rabid racism and anti-migrant hostility is not marginal in the Tory party. I think Theresa May is ideologically a racist and anti-migrant. You can see it from her. She's always gone above what she needs to do when it comes to, making this country literally a hostile environment for migrants. You see it from when she was in the Home Office and when she was Home Secretary to now. And the people that she's constantly trying to romance and constantly making the central relevant part of this whole process and I think what I'm nervous of is, and I think you discussed this a bit in maybe the last Tisky Sour, it might have been on Novara, about Novara FM, was about where is the Tory base at, and when they finally get to elect their next leader, which they haven't had a leadership vote in 15 years, I think it's going to be kind of a shock to a lot of people.
Will it be one of the Grand Wizards?
I mean, unless they manage to not get the two kind of centrists in the final stage, which I don't think they'll be able to do. I think it will have to be a centrist and then a right winger in order to appease their backbenchers. I don't think that their base is going to go for. So I think this is not a marginal group. This kind of deeply anti-migrant force in the Tory party. It's very different from Cameronism.
I just want to get up the Laura Koinsberg tweet, because I think we learnt as much about the BBC as we did the Tory party in this sort of dreadful incident. So first of all, she does this tweet and she seemingly doesn't know that anything is worrying in the fact that they've called themselves the Grand Wizards. Then she leaves Twitter for an hour and a half, comes back and she sees that her notifications are on fire. She's like, oh, apparently this was somewhat controversial. People have taken issue at the fact that 13 white Tories have named themselves after the KKK. I mean, one of the defences I also saw on Twitter was, no, this isn't a reference to the KKK. It's a reference to the Freemasons, another progressive group.
Great, that makes it much better.
Who are a fan of ethnic diversity as well as equal gender relations. But her follow-up is amazing, because it's just catching up on timeline. For avoidance of doubt, a couple of insiders told me using the nickname informally. No intended connection to anything else. So it's the most... I mean, why it shows everything that's wrong with the BBC is, for the first, this is classic Laura Koinsberg reporting, which is all period drama. Oh, I heard my one insider told me this. It's sort of her whole job is to show off that she has the WhatsApp number of some cabinet ministers who'll tell her oh, I gave my nickname this. It's sort of
I'm taking for granted what people MPs tell her.
Exactly.
That's not what you're meant to do.
Not knowing what the Grand Wizards are, as the chief political correspondent of the BBC, is a bit
lack
much.
Of historical knowledge.
If any man on the street doesn't know that that's what the Grand Wizards is a reference to, and they think it's just something in Harry Potter, that's fine. But she's in a position of slightly more influence, and then coming back and just taking them at their word. And it's like she's working for their PR. They told me the nickname informally, as if being racist informally is
it's just cool. I mean, so I think that's true. I think the other problem is just the trivializing nature of this kind of reporting, right? That sort of treats politics as a parlour game, as if what really matters is who's up and who's down and who said what about who to who and to whom. And I think that stops it being a proper debate about serious issues. And I think we see that in Brexit, that even at this late stage, the inability to understand the substance of the question at hand is remarkable, right? And that's true across Parliament. It's one of the reasons that I think this indicative votes process is actually, when you take a step back, it is delusional and ludicrous. It's ridiculous to think that in 12 or 13 days before we're due to leave the EU, that a group of people who've shown themselves manifestly incapable of getting their heads around the complexity of the issues are suddenly going to solve this problem through a series of indicative votes and do something that the British government's failed to do for nearly 3 years now. I mean, it's just, we've got to stop pretending that this is a sensible process. It's not.
Well, I mean, if the indicative votes is ridiculous, if the meaningful vote free, well, I suppose that's one thing first, actually. So the meaningful vote free, Jacob Rees-Mogg has already said he'll vote for it. Do you think the schmoozing could have been successful? Do you think also if she stands down, that's going to help her get a majority in Parliament?
Well, I have to say, I find this idea that somehow the decisive factor isn't the deal, but is whether Theresa May stands down or not, is so deeply offensive, because again, it trivialises the relationship between the UK and the European Union down to who gets to lead the Tory party. And that is a ridiculous basis on which to decide whether a deal goes ahead or not.
Yeah, and also I think it goes without saying that Theresa May is going to stand down pretty...
Yeah, we know that, exactly.
In the near future. I don't think that's for her to decide, essentially. But also, I think that part of this strategy of we just want this over and done with, I understand it. And a lot of the commentators especially being can't they just get on with it? Can't they just, sort this out? We just want to get on with it. That also trivializes the moment that we're in. This is an incredibly serious moment that is going to have long-term impacts on the poorest people in this country. If it's done right, if it's done wrong, the impacts, particularly on the working classes of this country and on people of colour and on immigrants in this country, is going to be catastrophic. And I think this kind of grinding us down into this exhausting position where we're discussing whether parliamentarians are just going to vote for something just to get the process done with is really worrying. And it's a way that you can cover a kind of multitude of right-wing sins by exhausting the process by groups of people, including the commentariat, that aren't going to be at the sharp edge of a botched Brexit, essentially.
But who are getting excited about nicknames that they're getting sent on WhatsApp.
Right.
Yeah.
Tom, one option we haven't discussed is no deal. I think last year you had the opinion that no deal was a hoax. It was being used by Theresa May purely to browbush MPs into voting for her deal. Do you still think it's a hoax? Or do you think that it could happen on, the 12th of May? 12th of April?
Well, you've got to separate two things out, right? Was the intention that it was a political hoax designed to whip MPs into voting for her deal? Absolutely, unquestionably. Does that mean that it's an impossibility? Well, no, because it's gone from being a really poorly conceived plan that was this idea that you could threaten MPs with this catastrophic event of no deal. But the problem is it's a very foolish strategy, partly because the radical right of the Conservative Party have embraced it as their preferred option. And I think it's one of those things that is very poorly understood. So why is no deal so problematic? Well, no deal doesn't mean just walking away and keeping the status quo. It means ripping up trade deals with 67 nations, 27 nations of the EU, and 40 nations through which we have trading arrangements through the EU. And doing that overnight is like imposing sanctions on yourself. It's really stupid. Why on earth would you choose to do it? So no deal, I think, was always intended as merely a threat, and it's a sign of the abject failure of British statecraft, both the Conservative Party, but also, by the way, the civil service, who indulged this behaviour, for this to now come about. And actually, through this period, the civil service should have forced a series of ministerial directions where basically ministers are forced to put in writing a request to civil servants because the civil servants do not believe it's the right thing to do. And instead they acquiesced and played along with this ridiculous enterprise of pretending that the fifth largest economy in the world and UN Security Council member would overnight place sanctions on itself. And that is a ridiculous position to be in.
Yeah, I do think that the idea of the way that a lot of people understand a no-deal Brexit is this idea that it would either nothing would change, or we would go back to how things were before we joined the EU, to like 1970, the 1970s. But obviously, as you said, like, no, it's about the fact, and with all the criticisms of the EU I have, particularly economically, like, this is what we've built our economic system on. Like, we've built it around this, like, this institution. And if we're going to remove ourselves from it, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, because of, the fact that this is a neoliberal institution that forces through neoliberal policies on its member states.
I don't agree with that, but we can talk about that.
Yeah,
separately.
but it can't happen overnight. It has to happen. It has to be a much more measured and considered disaffiliation.
So do you think when David Davis asked civil servants, because I haven't heard this before actually, when David Davis asked civil servants to begin preparations for no deal, do you think they should have just said, no, that's a ridiculous request and we're not going to follow through with it?
I think they should have asked for ministerial directions for all of the no deal planning, in part because the initial technical notices that they were asked to prepare, those were commissioned on the basis that by showing ministers the preparations that would be necessary and the consequences, it would reveal to them what a stupid idea it was to leave the EU without a deal, and therefore they would back away from all the rhetoric surrounding no deal.
Oh, so that was a plan by civil servants to try and persuade David Davis and the Brexit extremists that they need a deal.
Exactly. So Humphrey basically saw this as a means to illustrate what a catastrophe no deal would be, and that's why they played along. And I think that was a fundamental mistake. I think they should have asked for ministerial direction.
What do you mean by ministerial direction?
So it's a mechanism whereby a civil servant believes that this is the wrong thing to do for whatever. There's a whole variety of different tests that you can apply, right? Poor use of public money and so on. And so what they do is that they ask effectively for the request to be submitted to them in writing. So the Secretary of State writes to the Permanent Secretary. So the Permanent Secretary is the most senior civil servant in a government department. The permanent title reflects the fact that they are the Permanent Secretary through a change of government. So if you change the government, you don't change the Permanent Secretary. They've got a permanent position. And so the Secretary of State writes a letter effectively to the Permanent Secretary instructing them to do something. And then that letter is published as a ministerial direction, so that there's a transparency before Parliament to see that the independent civil service thinks that this is not the right thing to do.
So then it means that the buck stops with the minister and they can't blame it on shit civil servants.
Exactly.
Because they were warned.
Exactly. So why on earth have there not been ministerial directions in this process? It's a very serious question, and I don't think there's been any sensible answer to it.
All right, we've discussed a lot how we got here. How do we get out? So Labour's policy now, what should it be? I mean, we can guess what Labour are going to vote for in their indicative votes tomorrow. What do you think they should vote for tomorrow in their indicative votes? What should they put a tick next to? Start with Tom.
Well, I think at this point we've got to stop this delusion that Labour from the opposition benches can rescue a Brexit deal that has been completely botched by the government with all the resources of the British state at its disposal. So at this particular stage, with just 2 weeks to go, I personally don't think you can get to a position that makes sense for the country. And I think the right outcome from this process is that there ought to be no majority for any outcome, a long extension, and the entire withdrawal agreement and political declaration ought to be junked, and we ought to go back to the drawing board and start again, because I think they are everything before us. I think is a betrayal of the public interest.
What does that look like in concrete terms, as in like starting the process again? Would that be a general election, or would that just be saying let's take a breather?
Well, I don't think the government's been able to deliver a acceptable Brexit deal. I think the public, since we had a referendum, are owed a credible option for leaving the EU, and I don't think they've been given a credible option. I can go into the reasons for that. And as a result, I think the right thing to happen, since the government can't achieve a majority for its main measure, I think the government ought to fall on that basis. We ought to have a general election, and then I think whoever wins that general election ought to go and negotiate a credible option. And then I think finally, having screwed this process up to such an extraordinary degree, whatever they come back with should go back to the British people, because one thing is absolutely crystal clear: is that the Brexit that was promised in the 2016 referendum could not and has not been delivered. And on that basis, I think whatever can be negotiated that is a credible option ought to be taken back to the people in the end, for them to have a clear, concrete choice. But I think that process is going to take 1 to 2 years.
Is that credible? So, I mean, I see why, if there is a general election, Labour's position should be, in terms of to keep their coalition together, seems clear to me. Probably we say we'll negotiate a credible Brexit and then we'll put it to the people. I mean, a criticism you could make of that, and I'm sure the opposition would make of that, well, the current government, the Tory party would make of that, is that if you go into a negotiation and what you secretly want is, what they'll say Labour want is they want to secretly negotiate a kind of shit deal and then to the country say we actually want Remain. So I mean, it's Theresa May's idea that a bargaining chip is your willingness to go for a no deal. That would actually make your negotiation position stronger than saying, if you don't give us a good deal, we'll just remain anyway. How do you square that circle in a general election campaign where Corbyn will be being told, you just want a second referendum? How can you be expected to go to Brussels and negotiate a good deal when, if the deal's not good, what Brussels get is the UK remaining, which is what they wanted all along?
Because it's not going to the souk and negotiating for pound of walnuts. I mean, I just don't know where this idea is that somehow we're being really cunning over here in the UK, and just through our just cunning genius of telling them that if they don't give us what we want, we'll commit a colossal act of self-harm, that somehow that makes us more credible. It doesn't make us more credible, it makes us look ridiculous. So I think having a much more mature approach to negotiation that says we both have an awful lot to lose if we don't work this out. Kent is only 22 miles from the European Union and we share a land border in Northern Ireland. Of course we're going to be dependent on each other into the future, and we need to find a way in which we can put our long-term economic partnership on a new political basis that responds to the fact that people voted to leave, to show them the trade-offs that are inherent in that choice. I don't think you can get a deal outside of the European Union that is good as the deal that we have in it, which is in the EU, out of the Eurozone, and with a significant rebate. So I don't think there's a better deal available, but we should try and find a credible option that won't wreck the economy, but allows us to fulfil the mandate set by the 2016 referendum.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that no deal is a bargaining chip has been disproved, I think, pretty catastrophically.
Yeah, exactly.
And even if that's not a strategy, by the fact that it's been defeated and the fact that we've shown that actually Britain is not willing to commit this act of self-sabotage, surely nulls that strategy going forward even more, because it's clear that, and particularly I think a Corbyn government would not allow that to happen if it was to be a general election and we were to get a different government. And I think you're completely right in that I think the EU have already demonstrated that they would be willing to accept a deal that is like the one that Corbyn has proposed. So I can't see why they would want to push a Remain vote down everyone's throats when clearly there is a kind of mandate in the country. Well, not clearly there's a mandate, but that we need to it complicates the situation further, and the question of what the point of referendums are and what what referendums do to kind of not honour the fact that this referendum happened. I absolutely agree that it's a difficult one in terms of what should Labour vote for, because obviously it makes sense for them to vote for the Labour Party deal, but it would be really strange to have a Labour Party deal passed by the Tory party. That wouldn't happen, but how would that change things going forward? It's kind of a contradictory thing, but I absolutely think that the number one thing that Labour MPs should be trying to push for is a general election. I think it's clear. Firstly, I don't think that the Tory party can deliver Brexit, because they have existential divides on the question of the EU that I just don't think exist in Labour. I think there's obviously divides in Labour, but they're not quite as existential. I feel like there is something that the Labour Party base and the PLP could agree on. So I don't think the Tory party are structurally able to pass Brexit. So I think it's a combination of Theresa May's shocking, poor stateswomanship, really, really poor, And the fact that I don't think any leader could actually, they wouldn't make such a hack of it as Theresa May has maybe, but they won't be able to pass anything through. So I think the short-term extension is a waste of time. It's frustrating. It elongates this painful process, whereas a longer extension, allowing for a general election, actually allows us the chance at a second opportunity that isn't going in with this hack-handed approach that Theresa May is going through, and would deliver a Brexit that would genuinely be the best possible option for the working classes of Britain.
Yeah, the best possible option. I still think it would be inferior, but it would be a reasonable option.
Yeah, given
rather
what
than
we're
what
in.
I think we've got, which I think is a completely unreasonable
Why do you
option.
think it's so unreasonable? Why do you think it's not credible?
So,
I mean, I can see why.
Yeah.
For me, when I look at the withdrawal agreement as it currently stands, the withdrawal agreement seems like any withdrawal agreement as it would be agreed. But the reason, as in like it solves citizens' rights, it solves the Irish border, and it solves the divorce bill. But Labour's problem to me seems to be that in the political declaration, it's not clear what our destination is. And given Theresa May might be about to be replaced by a hard Brexiteer, we don't want to let this vote go through, let this deal go through when there's still a possibility of Britain becoming a bargain basement, free trading Singapore off France. But you think there's something deeper than that, which makes this not a credible option.
yeah, so I think there are multiple really serious problems. So and as a result, I think current EU membership is unambiguously better than what we have in the withdrawal agreement. So just take a few examples, right? On workers' rights and on environmental protections, there's very weak, pretty much unenforceable non-regression clauses, which means that if you wanted to have retrograde steps in the future, that would be possible. And yet there is a sort of ironclad set of rules around state aid, and that reflects the fact that it's been negotiated by a Conservative government. Now, I happen to think that EU rules on state aid are a kind of mythical monster in the sense that if you look at actual spending on state aid, we spend 70% less than Denmark does, and Denmark is in the EU and so are we. So it's a choice that we make that is the problem, but the EU rules are blamed. But nonetheless, the state aid rules are very stringent. But those are actually, in some respects, relatively minor issues. The issues are that in either direction that it goes into, I think that it does the UK significant harm. So either you go down the path of the political declaration, which means a more distant relationship with the EU, and I don't think that having more friction on our relationship for half our trade can be compensated by trading with New Zealand. That is just a ridiculous proposition. So we just need to be honest about the idea that the vision
Cheap
for their
lamb, don't we get
destination-
cheap lamb?
Well, it's
That's
just
why
lamb.
Weatherspoons are in favour of
Britain
it.
is not an empire anymore.
It's not an empire anymore.
Sorry, guys,
Exactly.
but it's not.
So that kind of
Or
myth
at least
of
only unofficially.
exactly that myth of the great global trading nation, we run a massive trade deficit. We don't have things to sell. The things that we sell are services. Services depend on people, and people live in places and exist in time zones, right? So this idea that somehow Americans in Wisconsin are going to get their legal services or their financial services from the UK is ludicrous. So the destination in the political declaration is a nonsense. It doesn't exist. It's just ridiculous. The separate question then is about the backstop, and here, much as it pains me to say this, the ERG are right in their critique of the backstop, but for the wrong reasons. So so firstly, you've got to understand what the backstop, right? The backstop kicks in if no agreement has been concluded that solves the Irish border problem. Now, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, and I've read all 585 pages of it, you can have a one-time transition.
It's definitely more than any Brexit secretary has.
Yeah, exactly. You have a one-time extension to the transition, right, that can exist once. And it comes at the cost of about £1 billion a month. So it's very hard to extend the transition. You can only do it once under the terms of the withdrawal agreement. So you've got to assume that given that we don't have a solution to the Irish border now, in the absence of any known solution to the Irish border, and the fact that you can only extend the transition once under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, therefore, the backstop is not the fallback position, the backstop is the default position. And this is what is not being understood in the debate, right? The language of backstop is very misleading. The backstop is the default. It's not an insurance position. It's the default position. unless some whiz-bang technological solution that no one's been able to identify is suddenly identified, and I don't see that happening, and the transition is continued, which at the cost of £1 billion a month, and all the kind of political noise that goes with it, is extremely unlikely to happen. So let's say the backstop is the default position, then you say, well, all right, well, that takes us into a customs union, right? And you'd say, well, what's the problem there? Labour's policy is for a customs union. The people who support a soft Brexit, they say they're in favour of customs union. Fine. The issue is that the customs union envisaged in the backstop, right, because it is not a negotiated customs union, it doesn't include any safeguards and any say for the UK. So as a result, you get to the situation that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so EU negotiators in any future trade deal can put the entirety of the British economy on the table in that negotiation, and we just have to suck it up. So back to your point about what is the impact on you as a person, right? All trade policy is now outsourced to Brussels. We're completely subject to it with no ability to get out of it. Right? They can trade off whole sectors of the UK economy in any trade deal with the US, with anywhere that they want, with China, right? Why would they not in every trade deal from now on just simply say, well, of course, well, as part of this trade deal, we of course agreed to open up trade in financial services, or, yes, the UK happens to be a leading producer of pharmaceuticals. We're very happy to liberalise the trade in pharmaceutical manufacturing and production because, hey, that stuff happens in the UK.
But couldn't Labour could still negotiate? They could negotiate a negotiated backstop in the 2 years, right? And then the backstop wouldn't kick in. Sorry, not a negotiated customs union in the next 2 years, and then the backstop wouldn't kick in.
Exactly. So the distinction with Labour's position is Labour says it wants to have a customs union, but with a say. And people seem to think that this is a ridiculous position to take because they've asked for a say and the EU won't give it. But, there are 100 countries around the world that are members of customs unions. There are about a dozen customs unions in the world. Almost all of them have mechanisms and processes for the countries within them to secure their objectives and to make sure that they're not subject to trade deals that damage them. So I think, we've got to be real. This is not normal. Going into a customs union with no say whatsoever is a massive problem, and it is a very different position from Labour's position, which is a customs union with a say and alignment to the single market. And I can come on to the reasons why this proposal is different from the common market 2.0 stuff. But that was quite a lengthy, but hopefully comprehensive.
So that was your argument for why Jacob Rees-Mogg is right about fears of Britain becoming a vassal state if the backstop comes into play.
Well, in effect, what you end up with, if the backstop comes into play, is that you are subject to trade negotiations that you have no ability to influence and no ability to say no to.
All right, we'll do the differences between the Common Market 2.0 and the shared market in a moment. I'm going to take some questions, though, first. And as you're writing those, as you know, Novara Media is only possible because of your kind support. If you already donate to Novara Media, thank you very much. If you don't, please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, the ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears in more people's newsfeed, and make sure you're subscribed to the Novara Media YouTube channel. We've got about 850 watching at the moment. We want that to get higher, so please share this on Twitter, share it on Facebook, and keep your comments coming. I can see some question marks now, actually. Interesting. I wonder if anyone will know the answer to this. It's a bit geeky. The ridiculous and dangerous copyright legislation approved today by the EU Parliament is a prime example of why the EU is a democratic failure. Is there a single EU citizen that supports this? I doubt it. That's from this web MH. A risky one to ask because I'm not sure if any of you have read up on the new copyright rules that are going through the EU. Do you know?
I haven't looked at them today.
I guess they're raising a larger question of, do people support the laws or the things that are passed through the European Parliament? And I think that that's not specific to the European Parliament. Like, there are lots of bills and lots of things that pass through national parliament every day that I'm sure a lot of people, if they were consulted on directly, would not think it was a great idea, or they're not consulted on directly at all. So there's this kind of exceptionalising of the anti-democratic nature of the EU that I don't think is more anti-democratic than how, like, there's a lot of other reasons why people don't feel democratically enfranchised at the moment, and I don't think it's because of just the EU, because lots of people outside of the EU also are feeling democratically unenfranchised right now. It's because, like, the centrist model of politics is, being ripped apart at the seams.
It's a less powerful parliament than, I think, any other parliament in the world, because it can't propose legislation and it's only sort of consultative, isn't it?
The EU?
European Parliament.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, because there aren't European-wide parliaments, I mean, there just isn't really a demos that can make it accountable. I suppose that links into another question, which is many left-wing people who argue for a second referendum think it should be run on a Remain and Reform platform. You seem fairly relaxed about the EU as it's currently constituted. Do you think the Remain and Reform argument's slightly redundant? Because it's okay now, because we can just be like Denmark or Norway?
Well, I think the issue for me is that if you look at most of the problems in the UK economy, these are, and society for that matter, these are problems that come from Westminster, not from Brussels. So I just like, at some point, maybe we'll reach the limits of what is possible, but we are so far from that point that to me it's a red herring to focus on the issues coming from the European Union rather than from the issues that are generated in Westminster. If you just take the amount spent on state aid, the UK spends 0.36% of GDP on state aid, Denmark spends 1.63% of GDP on state aid, and Hungary spends 2.05% of GDP on state aid. So this idea that somehow the problem is European state aid rules is ridiculous. And so I think it is just, it's become a way of belittling ourselves and pretending that we are powerless. And it's a ruse that I think is used by those who support the free market, neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, Thatcherite status quo as an excuse to defend it, when in fact it's perfectly possible to change it. We've just decided that we're not going to change it. Now, I don't think that's true, by the way, if you're in a Eurozone country. I think if you're in a Eurozone country, I think there's a compelling case to leave the euro because of its deflationary policies if you're Greece or Italy or elsewhere. But I think from our position in the EU but outside the Eurozone, I don't see that there is a compelling need to reform those particular aspects. I mean, I think we ought to lead an agenda of reform precisely because I think what is happening to countries at the periphery of the Eurozone is a complete outrage, and the deflationary policies that are being pursued is harming all of Europe. So that's why I think there needs to be an agenda for reform. But we should be clear that the problems in the UK economy originate in Westminster. And let me give you one final fact on this. Not so long ago, Jacob Rees-Mogg was on Question Time, and he was, talking about concentration camps and all kinds of just usual extreme stuff. And he sat there and he quoted a statistic, and he said, since the moment the Eurozone was founded, the Eurozone's GDP has grown by cumulative 26%. The US's GDP has grown by a cumulative 42%, and the UK's GDP has grown by 44%. Right? And he's like, well, that's why we should leave this failing economic project. But of course, the other way to look at it is that if we've grown a bit more than the US in that time, there's not really any opportunity outside the EU, and it's clearly not holding us back. So what is the problem? Well, actually, the UK economy has been growing in recent years. It's just that wages have been stagnating. Yeah. So it's a distributional problem within the UK, the most unequal economy in Europe in terms of its regional inequality, and one of the highest rates of income inequality in Western Europe. And those are problems that were within our grasp to solve, and we are choosing not to solve them. But the problem is us, not them, and that's the argument I would make.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think I wanted to clarify what I said earlier about, being critical of the EU as a neoliberal governance institution. Those impacts are felt by the peripheral countries. They're not felt by Britain. The decisions around pushing austerity as hard and as fast as we've done it was a decision made by George Osborne. So I think, the overinflation of the role that the EU are playing is incredibly disingenuous and is being used by the right as a way to kind of create crisis that they can then seize seize hold of. And in terms of, so I voted Remain in the original referendum, and I've been thinking a lot about, a second referendum and whether or not I would support a second referendum. And I think the main reason not sure I would support it is because I'm not sure if it would change anything, especially because at the moment there isn't enough evidence to suggest that it would win. I do think that it would go be a bigger kind of difference between stay and leave and remain. It won't be necessarily bigger, so I think we'd still end up in the stalemate of random people claiming to know exactly why everyone who voted one way voted, which is ludicrous. But I do think I would be interested to see what a Remain campaign that is not run by neoliberals, but is actually run by, from a socialist perspective. I'd be interested to see if that could win more sort of a more solid ground. Because I think if we do have a second referendum, which my worry is that if it's run by people's vote type people, then Leave it will be a catastrophe.
Total
Leave will
catastrophe.
Absolutely win, and fascism will.
and they would deserve to win if those people ran the campaign again.
I mean, exactly, and that was the main problem. And also, what I would point out is another issue with the Remain and Reform argument that kind of concerns me is that.
I wouldn't argue that.
Yeah,
I
guess it's
I like that
the
going
idea of
for,
changing.
Don't even bother with the Remain and Reform.
Why would you bother with Remain and Reform? The obvious thing is about a question of priorities.
Yeah.
You would have a simple slogan, which I proposed before, which is you'd say, stop Brexit, let's rebuild Britain instead. And it's about where do you put your focus, your energy and attention? Do you put your focus and energy and attention on sorting out a very complicated relationship with the customs union whereby outside of the structures of qualified majority voting and in a new comprehensive customs union, what are the mechanisms by which you protect the interests of the UK? Or do you spend your time trying to create good, well-paying jobs across the country and reversing the effects of austerity? And I think fundamentally, it was a change election, the referendum moment, and you had the people who had created the toxic status quo saying
No.
Saying this is how you want, vote to keep things the same.
Yeah.
And I don't think you're going to win this with a Remain and Reform because no one gives a monkeys about reforming the EU. They want to know, is the NHS going to get sorted out? Are they going to have a decent job? Are they going to get a pay rise, which they haven't had in 10 years? All of those things are within our control, and all the time, effort and money that we put on trying to leave the EU is a massive distraction, a colossal distraction from solving those issues.
And I guess the challenge is to try and reframe what the EU is, because at the moment, we are living in the culmination of several years of scaremongering about the level of power that the EU has on us specifically. So whether it be from straightened bananas to allowing terrorists to be have the greatest time ever in the UK, neither of which are true. But I guess also for me, I would look at the broader context of another thing that massively terrifies me, that I think a lot of European parliamentarians who are spending a lot of time pointing the finger at Britain and laughing at how badly we're doing, the fact that there is a burgeoning far-right movement across the EU, and that they're not street movements, they're movements that are becoming incredibly close to power. And I worry that if we have Marine Le Pen, if we have recently in the Netherlands we had a huge gain of the far right in electoral politics, where how do we want to position ourselves if we're thinking of ourselves as socialists, right? How do we want to position ourselves if that's what direction the EU is going in? I don't know what that is something that I want to contextualize this entire debate about the EU in, because for me Brexit is eclipsing the fact that the EU is probably going to look, if the far right get its way, it's probably going to look really different in 5 years than it does now because of the level of political power fascists are gaining.
Right, but isn't that a good reason to be in there fighting it and stopping it heading in the direction of the far right?
But could we? That's the thing. It's we need to have
you certainly can't from
a
the
strategy of how are we going to take that on?
Well, there's also a more basic question actually, which is that if if people argue that the EU is somewhat insulated from democratic pressure from the left, is it also insulated from democratic pressure from the right? So if we saw Le Pen come to power in France, I mean, we've already got the far right in power in Italy, but if there's another election, it's not the Front National, there is it, the Liga are going to come back with a much bigger influence themselves in Parliament. Does the rise of right-wing populism in Europe have any effect on members of the EU who aren't in those countries? Can it transform the direction of the EU?
So I don't think at this point it can, but it depends on whether it can build a majority. If it can build a majority, absolutely.
In where? The European Council of Leaders?
In the Council, and through the mechanisms of which usually required 2/3 of population and a certain number of member states in order to pass particular measures, right, under the the qualified majority voting rules. I don't think the far right are going to get to that point. I do think that at some point there has to be a serious discussion within the EU that says, well, if you carry on pursuing austerity and deflationary measures, and that's principally being driven out of Germany, look at what you're doing to the rest of the continent. And at some point, you need to reinflate the European economy, because otherwise the far right will continue to rise. This isn't a surprise, right? If you do this to people, they get very angry and they support far right causes. And there is a better solution than just simply saying, well, beat them at the ballot box.
Yeah.
And that is make people's lives better by stop pursuing policies that make it worse.
So you'd reform the Eurozone, just not the European Union?
No, of course I'd reform the European Union
Oh.
and the Eurozone. I'm not saying I wouldn't do that, but I'm saying that I think in terms of the order of priorities, most of the problems we have originate at home, and we should solve the problems that are within our control first. Absolutely, I think that the biggest problems within the EU come from the Eurozone, and particularly Germany's stance within it. So reform of the way that Germany in particular behaves, I think, would be the second priority compared to the domestic reform programme that is in our control. And then I think the third priority is then reform of both the treaties and the institutions of the European Union. I've asked this question before, but why can't we have a trade union directive and level up on trade union rights across the European Union?
Yeah, and I think the success of the manifesto in the 2017 election demonstrates that reframing why people's lives are the way that they are, and why we're being told abstract things like Britain is the 5th largest economy and our GDP is this, and doesn't relate to what people are going through, is because of these particular decisions that have been made that can be unmade. The 2017 manifesto showed that actually that is something that can be received quite well. And I want to see more of that. I want to see that being pushed, that reorientation being pushed more, because at the end of the day, we have been sold a false narrative of why people's lives are getting worse as the country is supposedly getting richer.
Well, I think that's the other bit. We've got to pick up on this. I want to pick up on that point about the 5th richest economy, because it's one of those things that people often repeat. Right? I was repeating at the start of this conversation, saying the 5th largest, which is different from the 5th richest. The 5th largest is because we are a relatively large country with a high per capita income. If you look at per capita income and you rank it, the UK is somewhere between the 21st and 25th richest country. And I think our own perceptions of ourselves and our ability to flourish and prosper in the world, I think, would be a bit different if we contextualized it and said there are many other successful countries around the world, and this idea that we, could almost be the top dog and we're still, the top tier of nation, we're far and above everyone else, is just not in fact true.
Let's get back to what's going to happen next. We've got from Max Douglas, we've only got about 5 minutes left as well. Is there a realistic path to a general election in the next couple of months? If so, what is it? So we've talked about what Labour's policy should be. Is there any chance of a general election? How would it occur? What's the step-by-step process in which, in the next 2 months, we have a new government?
This is what I want to know so that I can instigate it.
Well, I think the path there would be this. I think you would have no majority for any Brexit outcome through the indicative votes, and let's see what happens tomorrow. I could be surprised. maybe there's a majority for a customs union, but I'd be surprised. I mean, you never know, right? I think to get to that majority, you need a lot of Tory MPs to go back to their constituency associations and say, you know how I told you we were going to be this global Britain and great global trading nation? Well, actually, we're not, and we're shutting down the Department for International Trade, and you can forget all that, great trade deals around the world. I just don't believe they'll do that. So maybe I'm wrong, but opposition parties together would all have to be voting for a customs union to get it to a majority, and have Tory rebels who are prepared to do that. So, it doesn't take many Labour or SNP MPs just not to back a customs union. It won't get to a majority. So I'd be surprised if we get there. So the sequence would be no majority for any outcome. Meaningful vote 3 comes back and is defeated again, which is what I think it should be. Whether it will be, I can't be sure, but we've also got to remember this idea that somehow it's success to have only been defeated by 40 votes is ridiculous. It needs 1 vote to defeat it for it to have been defeated. So the sequence would be no outcome for no majority for any outcome. Meaningful vote 3 defeated. That then forces the UK to avoid no deal to go for European Parliament elections. I think then what you could do is that you could call a general election for the 23rd of May, the day of the European Parliament elections, as a way of changing the parliamentary arithmetic and have people vote in both. And I think that would make them less angry about having European Parliament elections if they were having a general election at the same time. But have that as, if you've rejected every outcome, you've rejected her deal, then all you're left are process options, and the 2 process options on the table are a general election or a second referendum, and I simply don't know whether they would prefer one or the other, because I can't know their thinking. But if you've rejected every outcome, you're only left with processes.
Yeah, and I wonder what role the fact that a lot of people in Parliament don't want Corbyn to be Prime Minister will play in how they will vote at each of those stages.
Role.
Yeah,
huge role.
And and I think it's this thing that I'm realising the more that I go on kind of mainstream media stuff, is this idea that they're all on the same side. Like, they make this big song and dance of, like, Jess Phillips making this big song and dance of, like, how much she hates the Tories. Like, if it's the Tories or Corbyn, they are, like, a lot of the PLP are fundamentally not on the side of their membership. They are on the side of the status quo that they are very much in love with, because it's privileges them in a lot of ways. And I think that, like, I think that is, for me, that is the thing that I worry about, because I feel like I wonder how much of Parliament will, because I think a lot of people in Parliament know that in a general election scenario, Corbyn would actually do quite well. And I wonder how much the fear of a Corbyn in number 10 would lead to the Labour Party, like, people in the Labour Party self-sabotaging in that way.
I think we have to be realistic about what a Corbyn government would be able to do at this stage anyway, for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, which is that as long as the SNP remains strong in Scotland, it's almost impossible to see any path to a majority Labour government. So you're looking at a coalition confidence and supply type arrangement with possibly the SNP, maybe the SNP plus the Liberals and the TIG, which are all kind of merging into the same thing.
Oh God, that sounds like a nightmare. All of them.
They are definitely. So someone told me the other day that Vince Cable told a group of people that the Lib Dems will be entering into an alliance or a merger with TIG.
Oh no, I don't. I mean, it seems like a nightmare to be relying on a confidence in supply from them. I'm sure the Lib Dems and TIG will align.
Yeah. So I think you've got to be realistic about what a Labour government would look like. It would be a negotiated position, not a Labour majority position, and it would have come in at a time of national crisis with the UK in a real hole that had been dug by the Conservative Party on Brexit, first by promising a referendum, then by holding a referendum, then by losing a referendum, and then by negotiating a crappy agreement with the EU that Parliament couldn't support. So having, been very busy digging a big hole for the UK for us all to go and sit in, a Labour government coming in under those circumstances, not in a majority but a minority government, with a confidence in supply arrangement and having to deal with the cluster fuck that is Brexit.
Yeah.
You can swear here.
Yeah.
So it's going to be mild European social democracy, basically, and the deep state shouldn't have that much of a problem with it, and Jess Phillips can just vote the right way when it comes to economics.
Well, you've got to
and we won't
wonder
leave
why all these
NATO.
people who are getting really wound up about how terrible and dangerous it's going to be. The reality is that it's not going to be a kind of radical reforming government if it comes in these circumstances, because the circumstances it's in, and that's not a reflection on the Labour Party, that's a reflection on the political circumstances that it finds itself in, of Brexit chaos and coalition government.
And not having
Sorry to be
replaced any of its
disappointing,
shit
but,
MPs yet.
Huh?
And not having replaced any of its shit MPs
But
yet.
do you feel like it's easy to predict what the outcome of the general election will be? Like, particularly when you look at Scotland, like they suffered massive blows in the last, like the SNP suffered massive blows in the last election, and I don't think that the SNP are gaining any power since then. They might stay the same, but I think if it was going to go either way, it would be towards losses.
I genuinely don't know, right? I mean,
Yeah.
who can know? What I do know is that I don't think that the Labour Party has broken through in Scotland yet. I don't think that's a particularly controversial point of view. I think that the impact of TIG Lib Dem kind of revival is sort of relatively limited because they haven't got themselves in a position where they can stand in many seats. So I don't think if there's an election in the next few months, I don't think they're going to suddenly be a particularly decisive factor. I do think, however, if Labour goes into that election without promising a second referendum, I think realistically you'll see a massive surge in support for second referendum parties, because what we know is that just look at what's happened the last few days, right? 6 million people have been motivated enough by the European issue to bother to sign an online petition. Now, is the online petition going to change anything? No. But as showing that 6 million people are that motivated that they could be bothered to go and sign a petition about it suggests that if Labour fails to offer a second referendum as part of its general election offer, then I think Labour will be wiped out.
But do you think that 6 million maps on to constituency dominance? Like, how geographic is it?
Well, it has to with that many.
It's just so many.
6 million people, however they're spread out, is going to have some electoral impact.
Yeah, but I mean...
So I was looking at the constituencies, right? And the lowest level is of number of people signing a petition is 2 or 3%, and the highest number is 20% in Islington. The issue is that if those people suddenly switch to, let's say, the Lib Dems or something, right? If they're that motivated, it'll be enough to change the balance. So I think it is an important new force in British politics, which is a group of people who are really, really pissed off about Brexit, and they're pissed off enough to sign a petition to say revoke it. Right? It's not even a petition for a second referendum. It's a petition to just
it's really
cancel
extreme.
it. It's a really extreme position. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It's like fuck democracy. Our position is we want to stay in the EU, so just stop it.
Which I don't understand how you think that would solve anything, even if you want to return into the EU.
But
everyone
it's
knows,
there, right?
Yeah, but also I think you have to give, I suppose, respect to the people who signed it, because they know that you might as well go for the extreme position.
Yeah.
I reckon that 5 million people haven't actually signed it thinking that the government will just
We'll do
unilaterally
it.
revoke
It's to
Article
show political
50.
space.
It's why I also don't really like. I've seen sort of some people on Twitter smugly say, "Well, it's not going to change anything about both the
That's
march
not how politics
and the petition."
works, yeah.
And it's not how politics works. I mean, because the whole point is, you don't sign the petition and then you change government policy, but by showing there is this much demand, that probably will influence what Labour's policy is in the next general election, and it probably will influence how MPs vote on the indicative votes tomorrow, etc. So this idea that unless your march achieves X outcome within 2 weeks, it's a failure, is not a particularly good argument for someone on the left.
Well, and also I think there were lasting consequences to the Iraq War protests, right? Because it was that sense of government versus the people, and I think it's generating that kind of dynamic again. And I think that the fact that it was an enormous rally on Saturday does count for something in politics. I'm not saying that it means that they should now be listened to and it should win and any of that. It's just, but it is a new fact of life in British politics that there is a really large contingent of people who are really pissed about Brexit.
Someone's just said, I signed it and I'd accept Norway deal. And someone else signed it to force the debate. And they'll also be voting Labour. So that's our very social scientific survey of people who watch Navarra and who've signed it for a number of different reasons. I think let's end it there. I expect there to be much chaos over the next 7 days, but actually next week, unless there's a general election called within the next week, I suppose it's going to be about the Israeli general election, not about British politics. So thank you both for joining me tonight. I've learnt a lot. Thank you for watching as ever. Thank you for your brilliant questions as ever. If you support Navarra Media already, thank you. You are what makes this possible. Jim Sexton's just asked, is there a petition to scrap the porn ban? I'm sure there is. It is actually a shit law, I think.
What is this went over my head.
The porn ban, apparently, I haven't actually read about it. This is just what I was told.
Okay.
Over a beer the other day. So this is probably not this isn't how I should do research for.
You're distancing yourself from this.
Well, apparently you're going to have to.
You've done your research.
You're going to have to send
You've
people.
done your research.
You're going to have to send. Well, I was just going to use a VPN client apparently. So you just use Ola or whatever. So you just your laptop pretends you're in a different country where they're a bit less prudish about these things. But you're going to have to send to the porn site your passport, not in the post, like a scan of it.
Oh my God.
Or some sort of age identification, or like go to the newsagent or something with a thing and get a code. I can't. Something where you have to prove your age.
It's an age thing.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing is underage people don't tend to live in a house with people who are of age who also watch porn, right? So once you get your computer once you're like green lighted, like this is a porn viewing household.
I assume you'll have to now sign up.
It'll be by device, presumably.
Or maybe you have to now sign up to. Yeah, it won't be by it'll be by your laptop, and potentially now we'll all have to get accounts. We'll all have to get accounts. For example, gaytube.com. I've got a passport anyway. I'm 29. On that note, see you next week. This was Tiski Sour. You're watching Navarra Media. We'll see you next week. Good night.